Hey, U.S. History students. Today we are starting off our lessons in the second half of U.S. history, and we're going to be picking up after the Civil War. But before we get to all that, we're going to spend a couple days refreshing our memories about a few of the founding documents and important things that happened at the beginning of our history. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is why did the Americans want to gain independence from the British? And so we're going to go back to before the American Revolution to a war that we called the French and Indian War. This was a war where you had the British and the American colonies working together to fight the French and the Native Americans in the area. So it wasn't the French fighting the Indians, it was the British and the American colonies fighting the French and the Native Americans. But one main thing that we'll talk about over and over in this course is that wars cost money. Wars aren't free. And so this war left Britain with a large amount of debt. And the British felt like because they had used their money, their military, their power to defend the American colonists against the French and the Native Americans, that the American colonies owed them that money back. They should help to repay it. And so they started to impose taxes on the American colonies. But the colonists had issues with this because they felt like they didn't have any say in these taxes that were being levied against them. And so the rally cry went out of no taxation without representation. The colonists didn't like these new taxes, and so this movement began to protest these taxes that were being imposed on them by the British. These protests became all-out revolt as we moved closer to 1775, and we have a few major events that we like to cover, one being something called the Boston Tea Party, where you had colonists that threw tea off of British ships in order to protest the taxes on tea. There were several other protests, which we're not going to get into. The first fighting occurred in the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord in 1775, where the British and the colonists fire on each other at the first time, and the war begins. And then the Americans at the Second Continental Congress appoint George Washington to command the U.S. military. We're also going to get into some of the founding fathers of the time period today, and two that really worked to further the American cause during the Revolution were John Peter Muhlenberg and Jonathan Trumbull Sr. Now, John Peter Muhlenberg was a member of what we call the Black Regiment. He was a minister. He was a pastor, if you will, and he actively worked to recruit volunteers to fight for the Revolutionary Army. So he would give a stirring sermon on the virtues of the Republic, and then he would take off his pastoral garments and would be wearing a military uniform underneath, and he would rally people to join the military. And he was very effective at it. And so he's considered one of our early founding fathers. He was really supportive of the cause. And our second is going to be Jonathan Trumbull Sr. He was actually a governor of Connecticut, of the colony of Connecticut, put in place by the British. But he ended up siding with the Americans during the American Revolution. He was the only governor of a colony to side with the Patriots, with the Americans, and he funneled war supplies to the Patriots, helped George Washington gain members to his army, gain supplies, and that kind of stuff. And then he became the governor of the state of Connecticut after the war. We're going to talk about a couple of early documents, one being the Declaration of Independence and the other being the U.S. Constitution. So starting out with the Declaration of Independence, because it came first, it was the Americans declaring independence from Great Britain. I like to explain it as a breakup letter. It's the American colonists saying, Great Britain, we're done. We've had enough. We're no longer together anymore. And the author was Thomas Jefferson, who would become president later. But first he was a member of the Congress, and he was author of the Declaration of Independence. And in this declaration, it pulls out some ideals that were earlier espoused by a man named John Locke, philosopher. And the Declaration of Independence pulls out that all are created equal, endowed by their creator. They have certain rights that cannot be infringed upon. These are rights given to people by God, he would say, by the divine power, and cannot be taken away by government. It's the government's job to protect those rights. And those rights are going to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this was issued July 4th of 1776, which is why July 4th is when we call Independence Day. And it listed out all the reasons why the colonists wanted to be free and felt like they were justified in declaring their independence from Great Britain. This is a little section of the Declaration of Independence, a very popular section that you'll see a lot. It says all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and these rights cannot be taken away by the government. They are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He would argue, Jefferson, later in the Declaration, that if the government tries to take away those rights or infringes upon those rights, like he argued that the British government did, it is the right of the citizens, the duty of the citizens, to overthrow that government because it is an unjust government. Here's the section where Jefferson lays out that argument in the Declaration. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So if the government is infringing upon your rights, it is the role of the citizens to overthrow that government. The government should be protecting citizens' rights, not infringing on citizens' rights. And this is one of the foundations of our American government. There's a few other what we call founding fathers that signed the Declaration of Independence that I want to touch on today. The first one being Charles Carroll. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a Catholic. He was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration, and he lived in Maryland, and he fought for Catholics' rights throughout the time that he was alive in Maryland. Benjamin Rush was a famous doctor. He was very highly religious, and he became known as the father of American medicine. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence and believed that the Bible should be used as a textbook and it should be taught in school. John Witherspoon, he was a minister who was the president of the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton. And at the time that John Witherspoon was the president of this college, it was a college that trained ministers. And so he was highly religious as well, a Presbyterian. John Hancock, being our fourth today, had actually the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence. He said he wanted the king to be able to read his signature without his glasses. And he became a symbol of freedom for the colonists, and he actually was president of the Second Continental Congress. So when the American colonists are setting up their government, the first government they set up fell under what we call the Articles of Confederation. This was like the document that governed the states before we had the Constitution. But the Americans found that it didn't work very well. It didn't give enough power to the central government. The states had too much power, and they couldn't get anything done. And so it was too weak of a document of a government, of a federal government. And so in 1787, the Americans created the Constitutional Convention and drafted what we call our U.S. Constitution that we still have today. So the Constitution gave more power to the federal government and made the federal government the law of the land. It created the presidency that we now know, created Congress with two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. and a Supreme Court. So it created all three of the branches of government. And it came with some underlying principles that I want to speak to briefly. And these are not written out directly in the Constitution, but these are underlying principles that we see in the Constitution. And the first one is republicanism. Republicanism just means that we elect leaders to govern. It's not a direct democracy where the citizens vote on all issues. We vote to elect leaders, and those leaders then go and govern for us, create rules for us, etc. Federalism just means that there are powers reserved for the federal government, and there's powers reserved for the state government and local government. So there's certain things that the states have the power to do, like regulate education. And there's certain things that the federal government has power to do, like make war, make treaties, print money. And so power is divided. Number three, separation of powers just means that the branches of government have different responsibilities. So the president enforces the law, the Congress creates the laws, and the judicial branch or the Supreme Court interprets the laws. So they each have their own responsibility. Popular sovereignty, popular is people, and sovereignty is power. So people have the power, which means the people have the power over the government. The government does not have the power over the people. So the people elect their leaders, they elect their government officials to rule. They rule by consent. And then 5, checks and balances. Each of the branches have ways to check the other branches. For instance, when Congress passes a law, the president has the power to veto that law. And the judicial branch has the power to rule if it's constitutional or not and strike it down if it is not. And so there's just different ways that all of the branches have power over each other so that no branch becomes too powerful. And then limited government. Limited government is going to refer to the Constitution only has those powers that are given to it. And everything else falls to the states and the people to decide. And then individual rights, which means that the Constitution is set up to protect your rights. The people have the right to decide for themselves what to do, and the government does not have power over the everyday lives of its citizens. One more founding father that I want to mention is John Jay, who was what we call a Federalist, where he wanted the new Constitution over the Articles of Confederation, which were in place for America at the time. And so he wrote articles or essays in what's known as the Federalist Papers, along with some other writers, urging ratification of the new Constitution, which would give more power to the federal government. And so this argument was created between Federalist and Anti-Federalist, where the Anti-Federalist wanted more states' rights. And so in order to come to a consensus, the Bill of Rights was created, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which protects citizens' rights. It's a lot of protections against government intrusion, and so in order to get the Constitution passed, they put these rights in as the first 10 amendments. And here's an excerpt from the Constitution. Just in case you see anything like this, you need to be able to recognize it. You'll notice that it says, "We, the people." People are the source of power for the government, where it's governed by the consent of the people. And this just lays out the goals of the Constitution: to create a more perfect union and create justice and tranquility, and to help everyone defend themselves, and to create a lasting government that's going to be able to be passed on to future generations.